Don't you turn that dial or that station, because if you do, you're going to miss a really, really good show. Our guest is Laurel Harbridge. She is a professor in the political science department at Northwestern University. So you've been hearing about the shutdown, you've been hearing about the debt limit. We're taping this show on October 16th, the very day when they're taking a vote to bring the federal government back to life like we needed. I don't know. So anyway, if you didn't understand any of that stuff about the shutdown and about the debt limit, about Obamacare and about defunding Obamacare and about the sequester, not related to Sylvester, just stay tuned because we're going to cover the entire world in the next 30 minutes. You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And as I said for the tease, this is going to be a really good show because really there was so much happening in the shutdown. And folks, I focus on this. Half the time I didn't know what the hell was going on. But our guest this evening, Laurel Harbridge, she is a professor of political science. She is a fellow. Do you say fellow? That's both masculine and feminine?
Correct.
At the Institute for Policy Research, which is at Northwestern. She has a PhD from Stanford, which is like the best place ever. Well, almost as good as the University of Chicago, but anyway, they're both good. University of Chicago and Stanford. She has a PhD from Stanford. She has an undergraduate degree in political science and economics at University of Colorado.
That's correct.
There you go. Okay, so just to start, tell us this shutdown. I know that's not your specialty. We'll get to your specialty in a second. But you've been following it closely. Do you think it really mattered?
I think that it did. And I think that it did for a couple of different reasons. One is it shows kind of the extent to which the partisan conflict has risen over the last several decades. Shutdowns were something that started in the 1970s as a result of the structure of the budget process that was created then. And so you had shutdowns happening in the 1970s, 80s, big one that people hear about, 1990s.
1995,
96, exactly. Right. And then we really haven't had one since then.
Since then, so
right,
last
at least not to the
17 years. Okay.
And so this was kind of another big one, same kind of level as the 1991 in terms of the national attention focused on it. So I think it emphasizes the partisan conflict. I think that it also is a point that not necessarily will be deterministic in the futures of the two parties in the elections, but may have important consequences. And I think that it also has important policy consequences as well.
The shutdown may have important consequences. What would be the most important one?
Are you thinking in terms of the policy or the electoral side of things?
Let's start with the juicy stuff, the sexy stuff, the politics.
So I think policy-wise, it's not that policy has actually changed as a result of the shutdown. We know that the agreement that came out today really is kind of refund the government, extend the debt seal or raise the debt ceiling for a certain period of time, and make a slight tweak on even greater verification in the Affordable Care Act, and let's have our budget conference committee to try to work these things out for a bigger one. So the debt ceiling and the shutdown itself and coming back from it isn't necessarily changing policies, but it's giving both parties an opportunity to draw lines in the sand as to what policies they would and would not agree to.
So essentially nothing was decided on October 16th today, 2013, other than to give people a little bit more time, be the leaders, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the House and the Senate and the President, a little more time, because now everything pretty much continues in terms of federal government spending and taxes and so forth until January 15th, right?
Correct.
A continuing resolution means they just continue doing what they've been doing. The same levels of spending that were made previously will continue into the future.
Exactly, and that means in this case that the cuts via the sequester will continue.
Will continue. So in a sense, see, everybody said the Republican Party. If you listen to MSNBC, Fox are for people on the right, and MSNBC is for people, I guess Fox is for people on the right, be symmetric, and MSNBC is for people on the left. So it's just like nonstop if you listen to MSNBC. People always say Fox is so terrible because they're on the right and they're biased. And nobody talks about MSNBC, but I was watching it today. It's just like nonstop. The Republicans, they're idiots. Why did they do this? Ted Cruz, okay. Could have been Tom Cruise, that would have been different. But Senator Ted Cruz took over and then they didn't get anything. It's just nonstop bashing. Just like a lot of, not all, but a lot of the Fox News channel is nonstop bashing of Obama. Mm-hmm. So this show is different because you are what? Because you're a political science professor, so I'm sure people come up to you all the time and say, well, how do you lean? Because, the students, they're impressionable, they're being taught, and we're told that 90% of the faculty at the elite universities, of which Northwestern is one, are left. So what do you tell people when they ask you, are you kind of the traditional left academic?
So my personal preference is not to say, and my hope is that in my teaching and my research that doesn't come out either. I know some faculty are comfortable kind of expressing what their bias is and letting people know that up front. For me, I try to play devil's advocate on both sides and kind of think about why things are happening in terms of the incentives that both sides have, not about kind of who, from an ideological policy perspective, has the better policy at any given point in time.
Okay, so you can look at this in a very dispassionate way.
I try to.
You don't tell people who you vote for, right?
Correct.
You don't tell people your leanings. You have them. You do vote, right?
I do.
But you're not actively, do you donate money to political parties, left or right candidates?
No, I don't.
Because if you did, that would tip people off because
Correct.
That's a matter of public record. So you can be dispassionate about this. So let me ask you, who won? On the shutdown, did anybody win in terms of either a party or the House or the Senate or any of these people involved in politics?
So relative to there being no shutdown, nobody won. But given that there was a shutdown, I would say that the Democrats won.
You mean if there hadn't been no shutdown, nobody would have won? But
well, so I guess what I mean by that is I think that both parties took some hits through the shutdown. Both have seen approval ratings drop, but the approval of the GOP has fallen more than the Democrats, so more people blame the Republicans for the shutdown, and the favorability of the Republicans is lower than it is for the Democrats.
And do you think it's correct? Is it fair to blame the Republicans for the shutdown?
I think that both sides share some blame for the shutdown. You certainly have that the Republicans really wanted to use the funding of government in order to get some concessions on policy in terms of Obamacare. That's something that is somewhat difficult to do, though, when you have a somewhat small majority and you control only one chamber during a period of divided government. So I think it was Tom Coburn, who's a Republican senator, who even was quoted as saying that it was intellectually dishonest for the Republicans to try to get the sort of policy change that they were trying to get, given their limited power at this point in time. So they didn't get that, and they tried to.
But does it look bad? Here's the thing, cutting rates. It seems to some people, even though the polling went down for Republicans more than for Democrats, and both went down more than for the president, I think who, according to the polling, was least harmed, harmed slightly, but least. But, the Republicans made the point that Obamacare has problems, number one, that the House for a while was willing to take a stand and say, if you're not going to modify this Obamacare, because the Democrats could have come back and said, well, we won't defund it, but we'll make some concessions, but they didn't. So they drew a line in the sand, the House did. They had some support from the Senate for a while, and that's what Ted Cruz kind of said. Okay, he said that today. He said, look, this was not a disaster. And he said if the Senate had stayed with us instead of caved, we could have won. Well, that's debatable. But it seems to me the people who really believe in the philosophy, and the second thing is, tell me if you agree with this, is that the sequester, as you just pointed out, the sequester stays in effect. And the Democrats really wanted to get that. They want to spend more, right?
Right.
And so they lost, and nobody at MSNBC seemed to say this, or they didn't say it very much. And the Republicans won on that because the sequester is going to kick in additional cuts in spending even prior to January 15th. Would that be right?
I don't know the exact date of when it is, but
there
there
may
is
be.
another round
Right.
that's coming. Although that round, I think, hits defense harder than it hits
For some reason, the Republicans don't seem...
domestic.
That's a good point. Because some people would say, you might see graphics on the show where I actually drew up the wrong graphic because I said something to the effect, the Republicans support the sequester, sort of, because they don't support the defense cuts in general, but they do support the domestic spending cuts. But it seems like...
Although I think some Republicans are not as pro-defense when it comes to spending as they
Maybe
may
John
have been
McCain,
in the
for
past.
instance.
Right.
Yeah, so, but still on average, Republicans are more
Right.
concerned about defense, apparently, and defense spending cuts. But they seem like they're more willing to take that in exchange for the domestic spending cuts. And so they favor it more certainly. They're less concerned about the sequester than the Democrats.
Right. Well, and that's
So in that-
part
so in a
of
sense,
why
that's
the
a victory
super
here.
committee didn't work in
Okay.
terms of producing something other than the sequester, was that the idea was that the threat of cuts to both defense spending and kind of domestic social spending was supposed to be bad enough for both sides to reach an agreement. And it turns out that it wasn't.
Well,
And
it
that's
wasn't,
exactly why
and
we
partly
got.
because it wasn't bad enough because the Republicans weren't as concerned as people might have thought.
Exactly.
But they had concern. But the Democrats, you might have thought, would have been more willing to give to not end up with those cuts, but I guess they didn't want to give.
Right. It's a
And-
mix of policy and kind of partisan goals in terms of the angling there.
So you've studied this so much. I mean, your dissertation is it is on looking at bipartisanship in the House of Representatives, the U.S. House, from about 30-year period from what's 73 to 2006 or something like that?
Yeah, to the mid 2000s, yeah.
So you've looked at this, especially in the House, okay? And did you find that was over that 30-year period a fair amount of bipartisanship?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of trends that come out of that research that are worth noting. The first is that when you look at bipartisanship in terms of substantive agreement between members of the two parties, and you look at it at very early stages of the legislative process, a fair amount of bipartisan agreement continued across that period. But one of the things that shifted over time was which of those bills got attention later in the legislative process. Essentially, when taking bills through committee and up to votes on the floor, did you shift towards more partisan legislation over time? And you did. So in the 1970s, bipartisan legislation was substantially advantaged. By the 1990s, partisan legislation had a slight advantage. And so one of the consequences of that, or kind of the stories that tells, is this kind of tension between policy goals, getting stuff done in terms of legislative accomplishments, and kind of the partisan angling that if you can do things in a partisan way, maybe you want to, instead of going about it a bipartisan way, because you can't kind of blame the other side or point out differences if you do that.
So if you had to summarize that 30-year period, would you say there was less bipartisanship in the last 10 years of that 30-year period that you studied than in the first 20?
No, so actually the kind of surprising thing there is the low point is actually the 104th Congress. So that was when the Republicans came in 1995, 1996.
That was the low point.
That's the low point. So this is, of course, with the caveat that data only goes up through the mid-2000s. But after that, you actually in the late 90s saw a rise up until 9/11 approximately, and then it dropped off again.
One would have thought you'd have more bipartisanship after 9/11, but not?
Well, so it was the increase in bipartisanship was from 1996 up until 2001, 2002,
And then it started
dropping off again and being
Despite,
replaced with more
so
partisanship.
that good bipartisan, the good feeling of the country being united lasted only about a year, is what you're saying.
Correct.
And then it started trailing back and going backwards in terms of less bipartisanship.
Yes.
In a sense, and you seem like a very good political scientist in the sense that you take a positive, not a normative approach, right? So for folks who don't follow this academically, positive, you look at sort of what happens. without making judgments of whether it's good or bad. People who do normative things in science, especially in the social sciences like economics, and not at the University of Chicago, they're very good at it. Seriously, I mean, Milton Friedman, when he was alive, made a point when he talked about things at the University of Chicago of making, and he's got essays on that distinction between positive economics, normative economics. At Harvard, they just don't understand that. They don't get it at all. Like John Kenneth Galbraith was not really an economist, but people thought he was. So he was always giving his views. Like, you have way too much choice. If you walk into the grocery store and you see like 30 brands, Galbraith said, oh, it's so wasteful, you should only have one. JKG, John Kenneth Galbraith, could make the choice for you. So he made these normative judgments all along, but you're not. Because I'm saying one thing is bipartisanship necessarily good?
Right.
It's not necessarily so. Maybe partisanship is good, right?
Exactly. There are reasons for both, and certainly I think preferences for bipartisanship versus partisanship are going to depend on which side of the aisle you're on and which side your party is on in terms of majority or minority status.
Well, okay, so looking at the current thing, people were saying, well, the Republicans were cause of the shutdown. Well, number one, were they a cause of the shutdown?
Well, so I think, going back
Looking at
to
the positive, not normative good
right.
or bad, just who did what?
So again there, I think it goes back to what I was starting to say earlier, which is that both sides contributed to it. So the Republicans, in terms of wanting to tie government funding to the Affordable Care Act, contributed to it. Democrats also, I think, were not necessarily, particularly in the Senate, were not willing to make the concessions. I think they didn't want to send conferees to kind of hash out
Right.
an agreement because I don't know the exact details there, but potentially, they didn't feel like they were going to be able to get what they wanted out of that either.
And yet, so Obama, when talking, he wanted a clean CR, clean continuing resolution, just pass it without any conditions. Wanted a clean extension of the debt limit. But then a few days ago, when he thought he was really in charge there, he was winning, the Democrats were winning, he said, okay, we're going to attach to this extension, he said, maybe what we should do is cut back on the sequester. And people looked around, well, that would be the height of hypocrisy because that wouldn't be clean.
Right.
And then when he said, oh, they shouldn't be fiddling around with Obamacare because it's the law of the land. Well, the sequester was the law of the land. So is Obama just like every other politician. He's really no worse and no better because he sat in this chair 6 times in the early 2000s period. Okay, so I think I sort of know him. And I actually thought he transcended politics. But with statements like that, he's just a complete hypocrite, just like every other politician, right? I mean, really, pretty much, it's almost inherent. If you want to do well in politics, you almost have to take an oath saying, I don't mind being a hypocrite.
Right, and I think, that's again where it's the conflict between trying to fulfill all the different interests that you have, and that often means that you're going to tell one message to one group or at one point in time, and another message at another point in time.
So you don't see anything wrong with that? That's just like a dog barks, politicians make different statements inconsistent to different
obviously
groups.
each individual voter gets to decide if they think that that is right or wrong. I don't think that there's a universal...
But it is pretty endemic. You've studied political science. That trait is pretty almost universal among politicians.
Very endemic to
Certainly
politicians,
successful
yes.
politicians. You could have somebody who never does that, but they seldom get elected to office, right?
And in particular, because most politicians in the U.S., particularly at the federal level, are people who have very strong political opinions. So it's always a little bit suspect if any of them say that they really, think that they're going to be able to put something above those kind of partisan policy goals, because most of them, even the ones representing more moderate districts, are not necessarily, complete moderates themselves.
Right. Fair to say, Obama does not transcend politics.
Correct.
It's also said that Obama, the standpoint, I was going to take us off point, let me try not to digress, okay? So just to sort of recap, so the shutdown is sort of caused by both parties, perhaps more by the Republicans than the Democrats.
But both, I think.
Both did that. And the shutdown, of course, when people say shutdown, the federal government spends currently about $4 trillion, sound about right, ballpark? Give or take $1 billion here or there, right? $4 trillion. And, the Republicans said, okay, we don't have to shut down the whole thing because we don't want to upset the veterans and do this. So they said, we'll just one by one we'll start with a shutdown, and then we'll reintroduce government back in that. And Democrats didn't want to do that, right?
Right. And that...
So does that mean the Republicans really weren't responsible, at least for many aspects of the shutdown? It was the Democrats who wouldn't open up the Veterans Memorial, right?
Right. Again, I mean, it's, I think, yes, both sides are to blame for different parts of it. And there, again, you see kind of what do they actually want? Do they want kind of policy regardless of how it happens in terms of, I think both sides, yes, they wanted veterans things funded, but...
Well, the Democrats wouldn't entertain that,
right.
that vote.
But,
the House voted for that and passed it.
But that's
the Senate wouldn't bring it up.
But that's
the
where...
Senate's controlled, for folks who don't follow this, the Senate is controlled by the Democrats to a large extent. The Republicans, to a very large extent, control the House. The majority has much more power in the House of Representatives than it does in the Senate by virtue of their internal rules.
Right.
So the Speaker, the thing that Denny Hastert started, and you tell me if others did it before, he made famous, well, we only introduce bills that are supported by a majority of the majority. So the House, the Republicans were the majority when Hastert was there.
Right.
And that majority, those Republicans, I don't know, it was like 230, 240. So as I say this, I'm not sure I understand it. So supported by the majority, does that mean if there were 240 Republicans, hypothetically, that he would only introduce something that was supported by 120?
Correct. And that's something that did, not necessarily with the rule on it, like that became the Hastert rule, but that was something that has been the norm going back for quite some time.
So it was
Republicans actually
took it from the Democrats?
Yeah, I think to some extent, and political scientists even have been using that in their models.
So it's not such a dastardly thing, because now the Democrats were talking about how tyrannical the Republicans are with the Speaker Boehner running it this way. He also has a majority of majority. They said just bring it up to a vote. You'll get a lot of Democrats, So don't worry about the majority of the majority. You might even have enough Democrats to offset, even if you don't have a majority of Republicans, right?
Right.
And Boehner wouldn't bring it up, but he was just doing what his predecessor did, but his predecessor before. But the new thing, here's the new thing. And it may be what people like Ted Cruz have discovered. It's kind of like the O'Connor court. Remember Sandra Day O'Connor for a while? She was really in control of the U.S. Supreme Court because she was the swing vote, right? You had 4 kind of liberals, 4 conservatives, and then you had Sandra Day O'Connor, who would go both ways, depending on. So there's the O'Connor court. So in a sense, this is almost the Ted Cruz legislature. Because what Cruz has discovered is that if you have a significant faction and you have a very close division within the Senate and also within the House, you can be the power because they need you. In other words, you're not, the Cruz followers in the Senate are not the majority, even of the Republicans, right? But if you have a bloc, there must be a word for this in political science. What I'm describing must be quite common.
So if you're, so what we often use is we term this someone as being pivotal. So in the Senate, the individual who you need of the 60 votes in order to get cloture to break a filibuster, we call the filibuster pivot.
Right.
In the House, we talk about usually either the median of the majority party, which gets you that majority of the majority, or the median of the House in total.
So what Cruz was doing is not that unusual. He's a charismatic guy. He may be running for president. People say he's junior and inexperienced. He's not that much less experienced than Barack Obama was.
Right.
Barack Obama only had 4 years in the U.S. Senate.
An important thing to note, though, about these individuals who are pivotal, and you're right that Cruz and others in his position do have some power because they are needed, but what they have power to do is power to block. They don't have power to move legislation forward. So they can't pass legislation on their own.
Well, eventually he has to start making compromises.
Right.
If he starts doing that, then he can pass legislation because he starts log rolling, as they call it.
If they make compromises and get others on board, but just on their own, all they can do is block.
Well, he's almost made this. He's not going to block. He's not going to try to block or slow down things in the Senate.
Right.
So he started to this compromise process.
Right.
Some would say he started selling out.
Right.
Has he?
Well, so I want to just take a moment, though, to go back and answer your question from before, which was about kind of whether the Democrats are to blame in terms of not going along with the piecemeal approach. And that's where I think it's important that, policy-wise, they might agree that they both want to fund veterans programs. Right. Neither party is against funding veterans programs. It's a popular thing to do,
Be like
and so
being
forth.
against mom and apple pie.
Right. But this is where their political incentives differ. So even if they agree on policy, if they think that there's some sort of advantage to be gained politically by, in this case, the Republicans wanted to do a piecemeal approach because it was going to look good for them in terms of saying, we are trying to get things done. Democrats in the Senate, if you agree to that, then you're reducing your chances of getting the bigger overall bargain that you want to put together. Right. So politically, it was not a good move for them.
Okay.
And so policy and political goals don't necessarily align.
So going back to the big picture, we've covered the shutdowns pretty much. Mm-hmm. And that, again, will come up in January 15th, 2014. Everybody you don't bother yourself in Thanksgiving and Christmas. Dinners can go ahead and presents and all that. I mean, because you don't have to pay attention to this crud. Use that word. All right, and then a little longer, because for the debt limit, that's February 7th, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, what that means is that the federal government has borrowed currently about $17 trillion. And that was the debt limit. We had a law that said you can't borrow more than $17 trillion. And so what they estimated it would run out, and they were pretty accurate, around October 16th. So it wasn't a fixed day. What the federal government is obligated to do is to pay those bonds, mm-hmm. treasury bills of different maturities. But if they were to cut spending in certain areas, even with that debt limit, they could have spent a little less, then they'd have more money to pay, so they wouldn't have to go over the debt limit. They wouldn't have to borrow. And so what people mean is, oh no, we don't want to change spending, and so we have to, we'll default.
But I don't think that it's quite that simple.
It's not?
No, I mean, I think that the obligations of the government are not just to pay our debt, it's to pay the things that we've already promised that we would pay
that too.
On Medicare,
Right,
Social
right.
Security.
Okay. No, I meant that.
Treatment.
But still, there are a lot of things that we're not obligated to pay that we could cut, that are not entitlements.
Right, but even, so to my
For a while.
knowledge,
I'm not saying
to my
forever,
knowledge, there has not been a budget proposed by either party that would have meant that we didn't need to raise the debt ceiling. So my understanding is that even the Republican Ryan budget
Would have to.
would have required actually this debt ceiling to have been raised.
For a short time, for 30 days, for 60 days, if you really wanted to work it out, you would have some leeway. There are lots of ways, I think. It's more technical than we have to get. I just thought it was worth making that point. It doesn't necessarily mean, now that the limit is February 7th, that if they don't do it by then, the world will end.
Right. But the other thing is that what's not clear, because we haven't ever risked it, is whether if you don't raise it when you come up against it, if you do kind of prioritize different aspects of what you're going to fund, how the markets respond.
How markets respond, and that's the important thing.
I don't know enough about those things to be able to say one way or the other, but certainly the speculation and the discussion throughout the last several weeks has been that if they didn't, that the markets would respond very terribly.
I mean, like the U.S. debt was downgraded a bit 5 months ago, and nothing really happened. You know why? Because the point you just made. The market said, you guys, we don't really care about the rating agencies. U.S. dollar is still really key. We trust it and so forth. So that's the key. We only have a minute or two left, but I really want to thank Professor Laurel Harbridge for coming here and explaining all of this, and I hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
We're going to continue to speak as the credits roll. So the third prong of this related thing was the December 13th date, and that's really a nothing date. Because it just means there's a target. They're supposed to, the Democrats and Republicans are supposed to agree on a 10-year budget projection or something.
Right.
But if they don't, nothing happens.
Correct. And they're supposed to get back in terms of the regular budget
So
process,
basically, folks, the House and the Senate and the President, they can all kick back for 2 or 3 months and then start.